the things you see, your deepest, darkest, wildest nightmares, you could never be able to conjure these things.
I also watched the 47-minute video and I had nightmares.
We do not understand that they are a religious death cult of a kind that we have not seen since ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're no different.
Welcome back to another episode of the Black and Jewish podcast. I have a special guest today, Judge Roy Altman. Judge, thank you for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me. So exciting.
I'm so excited to talk to you and learn about all that you're doing with judges and taking them to Israel. So tell me about this initiative of taking judges to Israel.
So we started looking to take judges right after October the 7th, and we ended up putting a trip together of 14 federal judges that went in March for about a week from all over the country, Jewish judges, non-Jewish judges, people who'd been to Israel before, people who'd never been to Israel before. And we did several things, all law-related, judicial education related, but in different tranches. So first tranche is, as you will remember, before October 7th, Israel was beset, really divided by this issue of the judicial reform. And actually, that issue is really very near and dear to our hearts as American judges, because the question there, as here, a question we've been wrestling with for 250 years now, is to what extent can we be a democracy when we entitle unelected judges like me or like the Supreme Court justices in Israel to invalidate or strike down as unconstitutional the laws that are passed by a democratically elected legislature. Of course, we have strict rules that we federal judges try to conform with when we do that. And those rules have been developed over the course of more than 2 centuries of jurisprudence here in the United States. In Israel, they also have certain rules, but the question is whether those rules are tightly circumscribed or whether the judges have the authority to just kind of make it up as they go along. And if they're making it up as they go along, then is it really a democracy? That's the question there. And so we met with both sides of that debate, which was fascinating. So we met with the Supreme Court justices and with the leaders of the bar organizations who are on one side of the debate, more like the status quo against the judicial reform. And then we met with the head of the Knesset, the Speaker of the Knesset, Amir Ohana, who really, as Minister of Justice, had spearheaded the judicial reform movement, the other side of that issue. So that was one part of it. A second part of it is so much of the lies that are being told about the modern Jewish state of Israel are rooted in legal claims. And you see that playing out in international tribunals at the ICC, at the ICJ. 2 of those claims I think are worth mentioning, and they are 2 claims that we really spent a lot of time learning about. The first, of course, is that Israel is violating the laws of war in Gaza and then in Lebanon, or that it's committing genocide. And we can talk about who we met with and what we learned, what evidence we saw on that issue. And then the other claim is that Israel is a settler colonialist state, that somehow it's trespassing or occupying the property of other people. Also a legal claim, also taken up by the ICJ in a separate proceeding. And again, we did things, reviewed evidence, and talked to scholars and experts about that issue. So really, it's a trip that's focused on legal norms and legal rules with legal authorities, educating our American judges on things that are very close on a comparative constitutional law question to issues that we deal with every day. And then we had a second trip in October, end of September, October.
Oh, so you went twice.
Well, now we're going a third time. So we went. The second time was 3 federal judges and I think 10 or 12 law clerks to the U.S. Supreme Court justices, the Supreme Court of the United States. And we did very similar things to the first trip. So we can talk about that and how things had changed in Israel between March, when we went with the first trip, and September, October on the second trip. And now we're going on a third trip. We had opened it up. The World Jewish Congress had funding for 15 more federal judges to go to Israel. But the problem was that the first trip became so popular, and the second trip, that 19 federal judges signed up before I could shut it off, and I didn't have the heart.
That's a good problem.
It was a good problem. So I didn't have the heart to tell these extra 4 that they couldn't come. So we're taking 19 more federal judges in March of 2025.
Amazing. Okay, Judge, I want to go back to the term genocide and occupation. What is the legal definition of genocide? What is the legal definition of occupation?
All right, let's talk about genocide first. Genocide has a very specific definition. It's actually a term that was coined at the end of the Holocaust, at the end of World War II, in time for the Nuremberg trials, by a Jewish man named Samuel Lemkin, who had survived the camps and who put the word together. Genocide means the killing of an entire clan, tribe, or people. The internationally accepted legal definition now is an intent, and this is very important, that's the most important element, an intent by one people to exterminate, that is to wipe off, to kill off an entire people in whole or in part. And so the question isn't whether Israel has killed off an entire people, that's the second part of it, because as much destruction as there's been in Gaza, we know that there's 2.2 million Palestinians there, another 3.6 or so million in Judea and Samaria, what the UN insists on calling the West Bank. Let's call that 6 million people or so.
Yeah.
And at most, even according to Hamas's numbers, 40,000 or so have been killed. So there's been no effort to kill an entire population in whole or in part, or to wipe them off the map. So the key element is, has there been intent?
How do you prove intent?
So that's a great question. You prove intent in the law by any number of different methods. You can prove it by statements that are made. You can prove it circumstantially by the actions that are taken or not taken by the regime that's allegedly perpetrating the genocide. You know, with my kids, we play logic games. What's not like the others? Okay, so you show them 3 pictures. What's not like the others, and they have to pick the one that's different. We do that all the time with children. We do that all the time in the law. Let's look at genocides that we accept are genocides in history.
Okay.
The Turkish genocide, killing 1 million Armenians.
Yeah.
The genocide of the Germans against the Jews in the Holocaust, killing 6 million people. The genocide in Rwanda, which killed, by most estimates, 800,000 people in less than 60 days.
Wow.
These are real genocides in history, where hundreds of thousands of people, or even millions of people, are killed in a short period of time. Just by the outset, we know we have...
By law, does the genocide have to also coincide with a minimum number of people?
It doesn't coincide with a minimum number of people if you have the right intent. In other words, you can perpetrate a genocide if there's emails and confidential messages to your army generals saying, hey, we want to exterminate these people. You only killed 1,000, let's say, before you were caught and stopped. That's still a genocide because you intended to wipe out the entire people. And actually, that's a very important point, because when we get to intention, we have to look at the actions of the government in question. The Israeli government and the ICJ did something remarkable. They declassified the confidential orders from the war cabinet. That's Netanyahu and Ron Dermer and Benny Gantz and Yoav Gallant and Gadi Eisenkot. Those are the 5 members of the war cabinet during most of the war. They declassified their orders to the general staff, general staff of the war. And what you saw is not one, this is undisputed, not one instance in the declassified messages that were being sent in real time to the commanders, not one message that evinced any intent to kill innocent Palestinians, let alone all innocent Palestinians, or to exterminate or wipe them off the map. You saw only the opposite. Every single message from the war cabinet to the general staff, these are confidential messages, not for public consumption.
Yeah.
These messages all made clear not just what the orders were, but at the end of every order, that the general staff was ordered to protect and preserve innocent Palestinian lives. How does Israel do that? They do that in a number of ways. First way is they have a remarkable warning system, okay? The warning system is so impressive that they have now sent out over 20 million text messages, over 15 million phone calls and flyers, and over 17 million social media posts to the civilian population in the areas that are being attacked in Gaza, telling them exactly which areas will be attacked and warning them about when the attacks will take place and telling them where they can go to get out of harm's way. These warning systems are so specific that when we were shown the flyers and the text messages, we the judges, you can identify where you can't be and where you can be, even if you don't speak Arabic, though they are in Arabic.
Right.
Because they're also color coded. So green means, hey, that's a place that you should move to or can be in the next 24 or 48 hours, whatever the time period is. Yellow means, of course, maybe dangerous to be there, but not the hottest zone where we're directly attacking, maybe collateral fire there. Red are the areas that Israel will be attacking. Israel is saying, we will be there at this time on this day, get out of that area.
Yeah.
And we saw evidence that those warning systems work to a tremendous degree. Just look at Rafah, for example.
Right.
Within 10 days, Israel moved between 1.1 and 1.2 million Palestinian civilians out of harm's way into the Al-Mawasi refugee camp along the coast that Israel had constructed precisely for them. Israel had built housing, food purveyors, and hospital facilities for over 1 million Palestinians. Let's go back to the game I play with my children. What's not like the others? Can you imagine, just take yourself back to 1939. Could you imagine the SS, the Gestapo, the Nazi regime warning Jewish civilians to get out of harm's way?
No.
Could you imagine them building housing facilities for 1 million people, including medical facilities and food purveyors, in order to keep them fed, immunized? We could talk about the polio vaccine immunization program that Israel has facilitated in Gaza in a moment, in order to protect the Jewish civilians during the war. Of course, the question answers itself. That's absurd.
Yeah.
They purposely put Jews in concentration camps and Jewish civilians in crematoria and in gas chambers in order to kill them on a massive level. There is no evidence of that. In fact, all the evidence is to the contrary. And one other thing I want to say about the warning system is this. The high-level military group is a collection of high-level officers and generals from every Western army, or almost every Western army in the world. The Europeans, the Japanese, the Indians, New Zealand, Australia, of course, America and Canada. These generals and officers submitted a brief to the International Criminal Court in its proceedings. And that brief, it's only 13 pages. I hope your listeners can read it, because it only takes about 20, 30 minutes to read. And it is amazing. Because that brief, from people who are not Jewish, not Israeli, not Zionist, independent third-party observers who know what they're talking about, makes clear about the warning system. Not only that none of their own armies, in other words, our army, the United States, or any other Western army in the world, has ever implemented a warning system to preserve and protect the lives of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire the way the IDF has done.
Wow.
But they say this: not only have they never implemented such a warning system, they wouldn't even be equipped to be able to implement a system like that going forward, because their armies just aren't prepared for it, on the one hand, and because their own civilian populations aren't prepared to say, we will endanger the lives of our own boys and girls, our own soldiers, by warning the enemy about where we will be attacking and when.
Right.
Remember, I was a football player. I was a quarterback in college.
Yeah.
In football, as in war, why was Napoleon the greatest general of all time? Because he was great at offensive surprise.
Yeah.
War and football are the same in this regard. Surprise is everything on offense.
Yeah.
Israel relinquishes the benefits of offensive surprise, telling the enemy exactly where it will be attacking and when in the next few days, thereby endangering the lives of its own boys and girls in order to preserve and protect the lives of the enemy's civilian population. The high-level military group has said no army in the world has ever done it, and no army in the world will ever do it, because none of our civilian populations would be willing to risk our sons and husbands and brothers' lives in order to protect the enemy's population survival. And yet, The one army in the world that has implemented that plan is the one army in the world who preposterously is being hailed into the ICC and ICJ on false and ridiculous claims of genocide.
Take me to the legal term of occupation.
So occupation is a kind of trespass, right?
Okay.
You are taking over the home or the land of a place that you're not entitled to be in, okay? And so we should look at international law to decide whether the Jews have a right to be in the lands that they now are in. So, for example, there are really three ways in which a nation can become a state, okay? You can win it in a war,
Yep.
and there are two kinds of wars. There are offensive wars, like Putin's war in Ukraine, and there are defensive wars, wars of survival.
Yeah.
Second, you can have a long presence in the land. You can be the indigenous people of the land who finally fights to decolonize and to win back the land for your people. Third, you can have a legal deed that says, I have a right to this land, much as you would in your home.
Yeah.
Let's compare it to a country that I hope all your listeners will agree is legitimate sovereigns over our land, the United States.
Yes.
Let's take our three prongs. First prong, we won it in a war,
Yep.
the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. But let's face it, it was an offensive war. George III did not want that war. We started that war at Concord and Lexington.
Yep.
Now, it was a just war. It was a moral war. But we started the war. It's a war of offense. George III, in fact, tells John Adams when he becomes the first ambassador to the court of St. James, what does George III say? He says, I was the last to agree to the separation. He didn't want that war.
Right.
He wanted to keep us in his back pocket. So we started the war, but is it legitimate? Of course it's legitimate.
Yep.
Second prong, are we indigenous to this land? Of course not. We came to this country in 1607, but we came as Englishmen.
Yeah.
It wasn't until pretty much 1760, 1761, after the French and Indian War, in a trial in Boston, Massachusetts, where James Otis was the lawyer for the people whose homes had been searched without a warrant, precursor to our Fourth Amendment in the Constitution. Sam Adams, John Adams, young men sitting in the gallery watching the trial play out, very much moved by the patriotic things that James Otis was saying there. It really was then that we first started to say, hey, we're different than these English guys, and they're not treating us right. And in fact, towards the end of his life, John Adams would write in his memoirs that it was, quote, then and there, in that courtroom in Boston, Massachusetts, that the child revolution was born. That was 15, 16 years before the country was founded. Does that mean that we're not legitimate sovereigns over our borders? Of course not. Third prong. Do we have a document? Well, we have the greatest document. Well,
Yeah.
one of the greatest documents of all time.
Yes.
The Declaration of Independence. But it was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it was edited by the 5 members of the Committee on Style: Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Livingston, and as a man with New Haven, Connecticut roots, Roger Sherman. He was like mayor of New Haven 12 times. He's like the Bibi Netanyahu of New Haven, Connecticut, okay?
He's the king.
He's the king. Who were these 5 men? They were all Americans, all rebels, all patriots. We don't have a document with another country that ratifies our right to exist as an independent country until Franklin negotiates the treaty with France several years later. But no one would deny that if 4,000 terrorists crossed the border from Mexico into San Diego tomorrow morning,
Right.
and slaughtered 42,000 Americans, which is what it would be per capita,
Yeah.
what happened on October 7th, and took thousands more hostage and held them under the earth in deep, dark holes of Tijuana and surveilled them there with guns and without food or medicine for now it's 474 days. No one would say, oh, well, that's kind of okay because the Mexicans were just reclaiming their ancestral land and the Americans aren't indigenous.
No one would
Nobody
say that. No one.
But that's exactly what people said about Israel when it was attacked in that way. So let's compare the 3 prongs to Israel, the
Let's
Jewish state
do
of
it.
Israel. First prong, they have won the land in war after war after war. Not wars of offense, not wars they started, not
Wars of
wars they
defense.
wanted, wars of existential, defensive survival. 48, attacked by 5 Arab armies. 67, 3 Arab armies, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. 1973, attacked by 6 Arab armies by surprise on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, as most of the Israeli army was at synagogue and at home fasting and in solemn prayer with their families. And still they won the land. Unquestionably legitimate under the law. Second prong, Jews didn't get to Israel 15 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 400 years ago. The first extra biblical mention of the Jews living and ruling in the land of Israel comes from the year 1205 BC. The Pharaoh of Egypt was a man named Merneptah. He's the son of Ramses, the great builder of ancient Egypt. And at the end of his life, he had his scribes compose a giant stele, which is a giant basalt black stone tablet that looks like the tablets that Moses would have brought down from Sinai if Moses could carry a 10,000-pound stone. And on that stele, Merneptah's scribes wrote down all of his military accomplishments. And at the very bottom, in 1205 BC, that's more than 3,200 years ago, Merneptah writes that he brought his Egyptian army to war in Palestine?
No.
Of course not. No such thing has ever existed in history. Brought his Egyptian army into Israel and fought the king of Israel in battle in places like Gezer and Ashkelon, 2 cities that are still in the land of Israel today.
Wow, I didn't know this.
And there are many more pieces of archaeological evidence like that. In Jordan, for example, the kingdom that was ruling there at the time was called the Moabites. You remember that from the Bible?
Yeah.
The Moabite king in the 840s was named Mesha. He wrote his own stele in 840 BC. He writes that he made war against the sons of the king of Israel across the Jordan River, where Israel is today. And he said something else amazing. He says he made war against the tribe of Gad, G-A-D.
Right.
You'll remember that God is one of the 12 sons of Jacob,
Yep.
one of the original 12 tribes of Israel. And then he says this. He says, those men, the men of God, have lived in that land, the land of Israel, since ancient times. Even in 840 BC, the people who lived and ruled in the land we now know as Jordan recognized that Jews had lived in the land of Israel since ancient times.
Yeah.
Arabs, just for context, they're not from Israel, okay? They're from Arabia, hence the name.
Yes.
They don't arrive in Israel until the 600s AD.
Right.
Muhammad isn't born until 570 AD. Islam isn't a thing in the world until 610, 615 AD. That means that Jews were living and ruling in the land of Israel for more than 1,800 years, at least, before Islam was even a thing in the Middle East. You asked me about the definition of an occupation. You cannot occupy your own home. You cannot trespass in your own home. The land of Israel has been the home of the Jewish people for thousands of years. You cannot occupy your own home. So that's the second prong. And then the third prong, do we have a document? Well, yes, we have a document. We don't just have, the Jews, a Declaration of Independence, although there is that, a Declaration of Independence from 1948. And I know for all your listeners, maybe there are some who care about the rights of women. I know that's passé these days. We don't care about the rights of Jewish women who were raped and violated. We certainly don't believe them when they testify like we would other women. But your listeners should know that it's one of the first declarations of independence anywhere in the world signed by women, including one woman, Golda Meirson, who would become Golda Meir, the first female prime minister of the land of Israel. We still haven't done that in the United States. I don't know if you've heard, have a female president.
We need to
in the
get a
United
good
States.
candidate.
I'm just saying. So that's that. But we do have more than that. There isn't just a Declaration of Independence. There's also an international decree voted on by the representatives of the combined nations of the world in General Assembly 2 times. In 1947, the combined nations of the world ratifying the ancient claim of the Jewish people to the land voted 33-13 to give the Jews part of their ancestral homeland.
Yeah.
Then the Arab nations invaded. The Jews, to everyone's surprise, a tiny army of 600,000, won the war by the beginning of 1949. And guess what? President Truman says to Ben-Gurion, go back to the United Nations and make sure everyone's cool with it after the war.
Yeah.
And Ben-Gurion says, no, we got our vote. We don't want to go back.
Yeah.
And Truman says, go back and get it ratified.
Yeah.
And they did. And they won this time by an even bigger margin, 37-12.
Wow.
Recognizing, again, the ancestral home of the Jewish people. So whichever way you slice it, defensive wars won, blood, sweat, and tears on the land, time and again. Or second, indigenous claim to the land. The Jews are the original occupants of that land. There's no dispute in the archaeological evidence. There is no evidence of anything called the Palestinian people anywhere near thousands of years ago. The name Palestine was only a name that was given by the Romans after Vespasian and Titus destroy the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD as a way of wiping out the Jewish claim to the land. It has nothing to do with Palestinians. It has nothing to do with Arabs who did not arrive in the land until hundreds of years later.
Right.
And third, Israel has an international decree from the combined nations of the world recognizing its ancient claim to the land and recognizing the land as the ancestral home of the Jewish people. And still Israel is being called a settler colonialist state in international tribunals around the world. A preposterous claim.
Judge, talk to me about the ICC, ICJ court. I've heard many times it's a monkey court, but why are we even giving our attention to this court? What type of power does this court have? I know major member states are not even a part of this court. So, is it a legitimate court?
Well, there are two different courts. The ICC court has essentially no power.
Okay.
It can issue warrants for people's arrest, and countries can decide, who are signatories can decide whether they will or will not enforce those. You've seen that many countries in the world have said they're not going to enforce the warrants against Yoav Gallant and Prime Minister Netanyahu. A couple things about the ICC court. First of all, the most important players in the global community aren't members to the ICC court. The United States, for example, not a signatory. Israel, relevant here, not a signatory, which means off the bat, the ICC has absolutely no jurisdiction over Israeli officials whatsoever. So the case should have been thrown out on jurisdictional grounds from day one. Second, and more importantly, even if the court were to find some bogus claim to jurisdiction, the fact of the matter is that the ICC court is built on this thing called the doctrine of complementarity. Okay. What does that mean?
What does that mean?
The ICC court is a complementary court. It supplements. It doesn't substitute for domestic courts.
Okay.
So it really only is meant to apply in situations where the governing regime is so powerful that it dominates the judicial system in its own country. So we as an international community cannot trust that that country's judicial system will ever put the leaders of the government in prison or prosecute them in any way because the government controls the judicial system. It's a way of saying, if you have a robust and independent judiciary, we won't mess with that system. We'll only involve ourselves where it's like Sudan, or Rwanda, where there's no such thing, or Syria, or countries like that, where there's no such thing as an independent judiciary, okay? There is no dispute that Israel's judicial system, as we discussed in the judicial reform discussion we had at the beginning of our episode, is one of the most independent, most robust in the world. In fact, the only criticism that has been levied at the Israeli judicial system is that it's too independent and too powerful. Remember, the issue is that Israel's Supreme Court isn't tied in any way to the government. The government doesn't get to nominate the judges. It doesn't get to fire or dismiss the judges. It doesn't even get to create a constitution like we do that binds the judge's decision making. So it's far more independent, far more robust, and far more powerful even than our federal judiciary, which is the beacon of the world.
So a state like Israel doesn't need the ICC court.
So there's no plausible argument that the ICC should ever involve itself in claims against Israeli officials because of the independence of the Israeli judicial system. But here's one more thing about that. Remember what I told you at the beginning. What we're afraid of, what the doctrine of complementarity is all about, is a judicial system that's too afraid to prosecute its own government officials. Does that sound preposterous to you? The Israeli judicial system is even today prosecuting Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, on corruption charges.
Yes.
He's not in trial for one offense or two offenses. He has 3 separate indictments against him that he's currently facing today in the Jewish state of Israel. He had to testify in court just last week.
Yeah.
Under these circumstances, we either have to say the doctrine of complementarity means nothing at all, or the case against Israel has to be thrown out immediately. The last thing I'll say about the ICC proceeding is that the ICC recognized that the claims of genocide are frivolous, and so they dropped that claim. The claim now is
so they dropped the genocide
that's
claim.
That's really not the main part of that claim. That's the claim in the ICJ, which we can talk about later if you want. But the ICC claim is really premised on one thing, that Israel is purposefully starving the civilian population in Gaza. This may be the most preposterous claim of all, okay? If you take, I have a friend, Matt Rabinowitz, wrote a piece on this in the Wall Street Journal, but there are many articles that have been written on it, and the data comes from the UN and international organizations themselves. The fact of the matter is that Israel has facilitated hundreds of thousands of tons of food, water, and medical supplies, not to mention fuel, which can be hijacked and used by Hamas, into Gaza to feed the civilian population of Gaza. And by latest count, the civilian population of Gaza has received, with Israeli help and aid, more than 3,000 calories per person per day since the war began, which is more than the Gazan population was receiving before October 7th. Now, it's true.
So they're getting more food after attacking.
It's true that not every Gazan civilian is receiving all that aid, but that's not because Israel is stopping it. That's because, and again, this is undisputed, Hamas is attacking and hijacking the aid in order to feed its soldiers and its fighters and to provide fuel for its generators in its underground terror tunnels, rather than allowing that food and aid distribution to reach the civilian population of Gaza. One more thing on that. There was a suggestion about 2 or 3 months ago that polio had begun to spread among the civilian population in Gaza, in particular among its children. Israel mobilized quickly and facilitated the distribution and inoculation of 97%, I think, by last count, 97% of the civilian population of Gaza with not one, but the required 2 doses of the polio vaccine. Again, go back to the beginning. Would the Nazi regime have done that for the Jews in its concentration camps? Would the Rwandans have done that in the genocide in Rwanda? Would the Turks have done that to the Armenians that they were committing genocide on? The question answers itself. These are preposterous anti-Semitic lies by a prosecutor and a court that have been anti-Israel for many, many years and are seeing a window to be able to delegitimize Israel's just and moral war of self-defense in Gaza.
Judge, why do you think that majority of people don't have those facts that you just laid out? Is it the fault of Israel? Like, we're not running numbers, we're not, in front of the screen saying these numbers. Like, why don't they know this basic information? I think a lot of people do know this basic information. I'll just cite one thing. I mean, I'm not talking about the international community. Yeah. There are huge anti-Israel elements in the international community. There are 49 Muslim countries in the world. There are 22 Arab countries in the world. Remember, when people say, we desperately need a Palestinian state, remember that would just make it the 23rd Arab state in the world. Right. It would be the 50th Muslim state in the world. Right. And if we look at the other 22 states, the other 49 Muslim states, do we really need another state that's a complete tyrannical autocracy like Syria was? Yeah. Do we need another Arab state that's a haven for terrorists, Sunni terrorists, attacks on Western democracy like Lebanon has become, or Shiite terrorist regime like Iran
has become, or like Syria was, and like the Iraqi militias that Iran funds in Iraq. Of course not.
Yeah.
But we can't have one Jewish state in the world.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous to my mind. But in the United States, which is what I'll talk about, in the United States, I've spent the last 14 months traveling all over the country, to Arkansas and Utah and Kentucky and Ohio and New York and Connecticut, all over the country, to talk about the history of the Jewish people and the legitimacy of Israel's war in Gaza and now Lebanon. And here's what I have found, and the polls back this up, that the vast majority of Americans do know who's right and who's wrong in the struggle, that the vast majority of Americans are not confused by which side of that fight is on our side and which side wants our destruction, that the vast majority of Americans understand that Israel is fighting a war of Western civilization against barbarism out there, that it's the tip of civilization's spear out there, and that Israel killed, in the last 3 months alone, more people on our top 20 hit list than we have in the last 20 years, okay? So in terms of the polling, Mark Penn, who used to run polling for Bill Clinton in '96 and then for Hillary in her campaigns for the Senate, he runs the Harris-Harvard poll, one of the best polls around. And if you look at the weekly results of the Harris-Harvard poll, they are astounding about the extent and depth of support for the Jewish state of Israel, our closest ally in the Middle East, around the country. And I'll give you just one example. When Israel was thinking about invading Rafah, and there was a ton of international pressure on Israel not to invade Rafah, that's where all the terrorists were hiding at the time, 8,000 members of the remaining Hamas terror battalions.
And our
it's where we
hostages
now
were
know
there.
that our hostages were being held. We now know also that Yahya Sinwar was there. In fact, he was killed there. A lot of ridiculous international condemnation of Israel for entering Rafah. There was a belief that Israel could not move the civilian population out, that it would take many months to move the civilian population. We now know Israel was able to accomplish that, remove the civilian population out of harm's way in just a matter of 10 days. And by the way, when it comes to the civilian death count in Rafah, it's the lowest of any part of the Gaza campaign. Again, proof that Israel's not committing genocide in Gaza. If they had wanted to, they could have leveled Rafah with all of the civilians inside. That's what the Nazis would have done. It's what the Turks would have done to the Armenians. Israel is not that kind of army. It moved the civilians out of harm's way. Then it killed the terror battalions. Then it killed Yahya Sinwar. But to go back, when Israel in May of 2024 was thinking about going into Rafah, tons of international condemnation, all of the mainstream press decrying Netanyahu's efforts to go into Rafah. Harris-Harvard ran a poll of Americans. And the question was, do you believe that Israel should enter Rafah to destroy the remaining Hamas battalions, even if it means that there will be civilian casualties among the Palestinians? I think the number was 76% of Americans answered yes.
Wow.
Now, of course, that means 24% said no.
Yeah.
But think about any other hot button issue in American politics: abortion, gun rights, gay rights, transgender rights, the Republicans, the Democrats, this politician, that politician, support for the judiciary, support for Congress, support for the president. None of those things comes close to 60% approval, let alone 70% or 75%.
Right.
An astounding proof of the depth of the commitment and understanding of the American people for our closest ally in the region. Remember, Israel votes with the United States more than 93% of the time at the United Nations. That's, I think, more than almost any other country in the world, including, for example, Great Britain, votes with the United States. So I think most Americans recognize that. They recognize that Israel is on the cutting edge of cyber technology, that it's fighting against our enemies, that it's killing people, including Iranian proxies who have American blood on their hands in places like Iraq and Lebanon, and that it's creating, put aside the war, that it's creating life-saving technologies for tens of millions of people around the world. Just today, there was a news report that Teva's, the Israeli pharmaceutical company's stock increased 23%. Because it received approval for new drugs that would attack ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. two diseases that, of course, are chronic among millions of people in the United States alone, that's going to be cured and managed by Israeli technologies. And when you think that that's being done by a country of only 9 million people, which is less than the number of people in my judicial district here in Florida, the size of the state of New Jersey, it's astounding what they accomplish and what they accomplish under fire. There are one of the things that I loved hearing from our judges when we took them over to Israel, non-Jewish judges, is that they thought the most important part of the trip was that there was so much that we Americans can learn about unity, about patriotism, about obligation and duty to your fellow countrymen and women from the Israelis. Remember, on October 7th, tens of thousands of CEOs of companies, partners at law firms, judges, doctors, and dentists turned off the lights of their practices, put on their uniforms, grabbed their machine guns, kissed their wives and their kids goodbye, and went to fight and die in Gaza and Lebanon. There's a lot we can learn from the Jewish People's Army and the way it came together in a moment of existential strategic crisis on October 7th.
Judge, what do you think about the day after the war? What should Israel do with Gaza? What should Israel do with the West Bank? Are you a supporter of two-state solution, one-state solution? What are your thoughts on those topics?
I won't comment on the two-state solution because I think that's a matter of American foreign policy, and I stay away from talking about what an administration thinks or doesn't think, and I certainly don't want to be seen as criticizing or supporting our politicians and diplomats as they engage in I think, needed diplomacy in that region. In Gaza, I think the Israelis are making clear what they think the solution is. It's going to take a very long time, and it's going to be a very hard, long-term project. Yeah. Israel has been clear that they are creating a perimeter, no man's land, so to speak, around the entire periphery of Gaza. That's I think it's 1 kilometer, just under a mile, perimeter area from the northern part all the way to the south. That's first. Second, the Philadelphia corridor, which is the area that separates the southern part of Gaza from Egypt. Israel has said that they must remain there in order to prevent Hamas from rearming through the smuggling tunnels that come from Egypt. Mm-hmm. And then third, the Netzarim corridor, which is basically an avenue that Israel has built bisecting the center of Gaza from east to west, from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the Gaza border fence. It's about 7 or 8 kilometers long, I think, and Israel means to stay there in order to continue its operations to deconstitute Hamas and make sure that Palestinian civilians can regenerate a normal civilian life in Gaza after the war is over. And they are going to allow civilian families to return to the north of Gaza, as I understand it. Yeah. But they're going to do it slowly and making sure that the families that are being brought back are families that don't have ties to Hamas. So what do I mean by that? When we, the judges, went to Israel, we met with Palestinian leaders. And
what did they say to you?
They want the IDF to wipe out Hamas.
Yeah.
And they're not allowed to go out and publicly say that. Some have written articles. You've seen them in the Wall Street Journal. You've seen some of them write articles like that in Newsweek. Of course, those are ignored on college campuses. Palestinian people that we meet with when we go to Israel uniformly want the IDF to wipe out Hamas and the other terror groups, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Lions Brigade, which is a terror group that has popped up in Judea and Samaria and what's called the West Bank. What they want is they want smart, young, enterprising tribal leaders, because the Palestinian population is composed of tribes.
I'm glad you mentioned that. People don't know that about the Palestinians.
Yeah, Hamas is just a terror organization that has been holding the Palestinian population hostage.
Right.
And what the Palestinians we meet with have said is we need to make room for smart, ambitious, enterprising leaders among the tribes to be able to pop up in Gaza City and Khan Yunis and Jabalia and say, hey, I want to be the mayor. I want to be a councilman.
Yeah.
But no one is going to do that if they believe that the guys next door are Hamasniks who, as soon as I go to bed at night, are going to come and decapitate me and all my family, which we know is what Hamas has done in Gaza for almost 20 years. Israel has released all the footage of the torture chambers that Hamas has had, not for Israelis. Israel left Gaza in 2005 to torture and kill and maim their own people. Remember, Yahya Sinwar was called the butcher of Khan Yunis, not because of anything he did to Jews. Right. He was the butcher of Khan Yunis because of how he would torture and murder Palestinian civilians in order to stop them from collaborating with America, with Israel, with the West. So Israel needs to create, with America's help, none of this will happen without the United States, and with the Sunni Muslim states, none of this will happen without cooperation from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and the UAE needs to invest billions of dollars to rebuild hospitals and schools and neighborhoods in North Gaza, to create checkpoints through which Israel and the international community can invite tribal leaders and their families to come back and repopulate the north of Gaza, and slowly, town by town, have these Palestinian tribal leaders have the courage and the confidence to be able to rise up and form their own community and build their own future for their children and grandchildren. That will never happen so long as Hamas is running Gaza, and that's what Israel is trying to do. I'm not suggesting it's going to be done in a month or 2 months or 6 months.
Right.
But that's the project 5, 10, 15 years from now. The other complicating factor in Gaza is the hostages. And there's a lot of talk about the hostage deal that's being negotiated now. There's talk about it being completed maybe by the end of the week. We shall see. Yeah. 2 big things that give me optimism about it, 3 big things, is that Hamas has made 3 concessions that they were not willing to make before, a symbol of 2 things. One is the dismantling of the Hamas's battalions, and all 24 of them have been dismantled, an incredible military achievement that will be studied by military strategists for decades to come, including the killing of their senior leadership, Yahya Sinwar, and importantly, Mohammed Deif, their battle commander, war commander, but also what Israel has done to Lebanon, to Hezbollah, removing them from the fight, and finally getting Hezbollah to say, who had always said, we will never leave the fight until Gaza is free or whatever, or Hamas is allowed to stay. They threw in the towel, and they left Hamas completely isolated and alone. Hamas knows that. So there are 3 things that give me confidence. One is the concession that Hamas is willing to give Israel a list of the hostages who are alive, something it was never willing to do before.
Right.
Second is that Hamas has agreed that Israel can remain in the 3 places I just told you about, the periphery, no man's land, the Netzarim corridor in the center, and the Philadelphia corridor in the south, something it had never agreed to before. And third, that Hamas has apparently agreed that the ceasefire will be a temporary ceasefire of what the reports are saying is somewhere between 30 and 60 days. I don't know the specifics of it. Okay. That, again, is something Hamas had never agreed to before. It had always insisted that in return for any number of hostages, the war should immediately end. And of course, as I just explained, Israel is never going to agree to the end of the war until it can assure itself that there are communities in especially north and central Gaza, bordering with Israel, where Palestinian tribal leaders have been able to take control of their own futures and their children's future, which means wiping out Hamas and making sure that they're not there to torture and kill their own civilian population. So that's, I think, where we are in Gaza right now.
Judge, talk to me about your personal life before October 7th and after October 7th. I can see that you're a very proud Jew. Your ancestry comes from Venezuela. So what was life like before October 7th happened? Like your colleagues, your friends, how was life going in terms of being a Zionist? And then what happened after October 7th?
Yeah, I should say, first of all, that my grandparents lived through the Holocaust, escaped the Holocaust. My parents, my dad's family ended up in Venezuela. My mom's family ended up in Mexico. My mom then moved to Colombia. And then both of them independently, when they were 18 or 17, their family, my father alone, and then my mom, her whole family from Colombia, moved to Israel, very Zionist families.
Oh, wow.
And my father served in the Air Force, and my mother was a nurse, and they met in Israel, and they married in Israel, and they lived there for 11 or 12 years. They moved back to Venezuela, where my sister and I were born, and then the family moved to America when I was 2 or 3 years old. And I should say, you said I'm a proud Jew. That's very true. But I'm first and foremost a proud American. This country gave my family everything. For a family that for thousands of years had been looking for its ancient homeland. We made it back to Israel, an amazing accomplishment for our family to be able to live in our ancestral homeland. And then we moved back to Venezuela. My parents wanted to help my grandfather with his business. He was getting older. But of course, that became a very dangerous place. My mother was held up at gunpoint, maybe once or twice, and she said, "We're not staying here." And,
was it because she was a Jew, or just because it was dangerous?
I think it's just a dangerous place.
Yeah.
And now even more so, all the more so. And so my family took a shot, left everything behind, came to America, didn't know a soul, didn't have anything here, and the community in Miami and the country as a whole welcomed us with open arms. And look, just a few years later, the son of that family is a federal judge, an amazing testament to the wonders of this country. I continue to believe and have always said that it is the greatest force for good the world has ever known. I love Israel. I'm an ardent Zionist. But one of the things I love most about Israel is how much Israelis love and support the United States.
Yeah.
I remember after 9/11 how I was living in New York City. I was a sophomore at Columbia University. And I remember going up to the rooftop of my dorm and looking down at the towers that had fallen on the south side of downtown New York. And I remember seeing a giant cloud of black smoke against a piercing, beautiful blue sky. It was the clearest sky I'd ever seen that day. And I remember that I went down with some of my football buddies down to Ground Zero that night with a car or a van to try to help them find and rescue people who I understood were trapped inside. And a policeman stopped us and said, "You gotta go back." And I remember saying, "Hey, no, we got a bunch of football players here. We're strong. We can help you guys." And he said, "You have no idea what you're talking about. There are mountains of steel and fire.
Wow.
And any moment, any one of them can collapse and kill you all. Go back to your dorm room and leave us alone." And I remember I went back to my dorm and I just cried and cried. I was so upset that I felt so helpless and hopeless.
Yeah.
And then the next morning I turned on the television and I saw people on the Arab street, Palestinians in Jenin and Ramla,
Yeah.
and Arabs all over the Middle East celebrating what had happened on 9/11. And I just could not comprehend it.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, my family and I shortly thereafter went to visit Israel. And we saw that every home had a black drapes and black flags up half-mast, American flags half-mast, Israeli flags half-mast, in solidarity for the mourning of Americans and the pain and loss of Americans on that awful day. So I've always recognized that Israel is America's greatest friend in the world, that Israel is America's closest ally in that region, and that if we care about promoting democracy in the world, if we care about stopping the spread of autocracy and hatefulness and dictatorship and Sunni Muslim terrorism around the world, there's no better weapon than Israel plopped behind enemy lines, spying on and killing our darkest enemies. And so I have always been a big fan of Israel and ardent Zionist, in large part because I love this country so much. But you're right that after October 7th, everything changed. Before October 7th, if you had asked me, like, what do I want people to remember before, I would have said I wanted people to say I was a model citizen, a fair judge, a good husband and father. But after October 7th, I think we need to stand up for the West. We need to stand up for our values. We need to stand up for the Jewish people, because no one will stand up for us if we don't. There is a war out there, and there are hundreds of millions of people who want our destruction, not just the Jews, America and everything we stand for too. The Russians are not our friends. The Chinese are not our friends. The North Koreans are not our friends. The Iranians are not our friends, and they are planning our downfall. And if we're complacent and naive about that, there is nothing we're going to be able to do to stop us. So I feel that, like Douglas Murray says, after October 7th, it's like you were standing in the dark and a flare has gone up. And now we can see where you are and who you are. And it was important to me to be on the right side of that moral divide after October 7th. And I really have devoted myself to standing up for the Jewish people, to standing up for America, and to standing up for our Western values.
Judge, tell me how it was living through 9/11 in terms of the media response from the international community in comparison to living through now October 7th and the media's response in the international community. What was that like? I was very young during 9/11, so I don't remember how the international community responded to America defending herself. But I would love to know those two comparisons of what happened.
Night and day, obviously. After 9/11, the whole Western world sided with America. Of course, I mean, it's preposterous not to. These are terrorists who purposefully murdered almost 3,000 people as they were going to school and business meetings and work that day. Who would side with that level of barbarism? And the international community, the media, the West, solidified behind the United States. And in fact, when President Bush created a coalition to go into Afghanistan and later Iraq, he had dozens of countries lining up to support his efforts in that regard. Night and day with what happened with Israel. There was some condolences from Western
like 2
countries
days.
for a couple of days.
Yeah.
But even that, let's not forget, was only some places.
Yeah.
Remember that on October 7th itself, there are professors at our most elite academic institutions. At Columbia, Joseph Mossad, an anti-Semite like there's no other. Professor Gruel at Yale, professors at Cornell and Berkeley and UCLA, who were not just not saying anything, not just not solidifying or standing behind the Jewish state that had been attacked so brutally on October 7th, with women and children murdered in their homes. No, celebrating as exhilarating and exciting the murder of babies and infants. You know, one thing that I think the Israelis got wrong, you would ask me this earlier, should Israel have done more in the media campaign? When we, the judges, went to Israel, we were shown the 47-minute video of Hamas atrocities filmed on Hamas GoPro cameras and Hamas cell phones, uploaded oftentimes to the social media pages of the victims themselves in order to torture their family members so that when their family members woke up and went on their daughter's Facebook page, they would watch her getting raped and beheaded as her final horrifying moments. And I watched those videos, those 47 minutes of videos, a compilation of videos with all these other judges. And I have to tell you, it was the hardest 47 minutes of my entire life.
Yeah.
By the 7-minute mark, I remember I looked at my watch and said, are we almost there?
Yeah.
And I said to myself, I've got 40 more minutes of this. I can't even believe sitting through 40 more minutes. But I'll tell you this, not one judge walked out. Not one judge said no. And I think Israel made a mistake. Now, there are millions of people, like we said, these professors who are anti-Semites, hate Israel no matter what. They would have made up whatever lies they're going to make up no matter what the video showed. But there are probably tens of thousands of people who might have seen that video and said, whoa, we are dealing with a barbarism I never imagined. Because here's the thing. On that video, the things you see, your deepest, darkest, wildest nightmares, you could never be able to conjure these things. The beheadings, the sexual violence, the burning whole families alive, children with their parents in their bomb shelters, an inhumanity that I think Western civilization just isn't prepared for. Our brains just don't account for that.
No.
And we like to think to ourselves, oh, well, you know, Hamas, they just want what we want. They just want to be able to take...
resistance fighters,
they
freedom
just want to be able to
fighters.
feed their families and take their kids to school. We do not understand that they are a religious death cult of a kind that we have not seen since ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're no different. And if we don't accept that, then we are next. That's the reality.
Yeah. I also watched the 47-minute video, and I had nightmares. Like it on that video, they're joking over who gets to cut off the head of a tie worker. They're like, no, let me do it. No, I want to do it, and they're trying to cut off the head with a shovel. It's so barbaric, and I agree with you. I didn't understand why Israel didn't release the video.
They gave one reason, which is a very Jewish thing, a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
What they explained was, which I believe, that there are some things, not you know because you've seen it, especially things that happened to women on that video,
Yeah.
that were so horrible, so hard to watch. And the family members of those people went to the Israeli government and said, we do not want the world to remember our daughter that way.
Yeah.
We do not want the world to remember our little girl that way.
Yeah.
And so we urge you, implore you not to show the world. And the Israeli government, it is a family there after all, with all their fights.
Yeah.
They are a family. They acceded to those demands. And I understand it. I would not want my children's last moments, horrifying and harrowing as they were on that video, to be shown to the world. But ultimately, you got to do what's best for 9 million people in the country.
Right.
And I think there are a lot of people, especially in this country, who, I mean, America is a moral centrist place.
Yeah.
We know right from wrong. We are good people.
Yeah.
It would not be hard watching that video to understand whose fight is just and whose is unjust. But if you don't see the video and all you do is read CNN news flashes or the misleading headlines on some of our mainstream media outlets, you might be justifiably confused about who's right and who's wrong here. And I do think that was a missed opportunity.
Judge, I know you don't have social media.
Zero.
So people can't find you. But could you leave the listeners, Jews and non-Jews, with a word of encouragement?
I think there's a lot to be hopeful for. I think there's a lot of reason for optimism. I'll say a couple of things about that. The first thing I'll say is that Israel's achievements in this war, the West's achievements in this war, have been startling. Even 3 or 4 months ago, go back to August 27th. What is that, 3.5 months ago?
Yeah.
I mentioned that date because that was one of maybe the lowest date of the whole war since October 7th. I think that was the date, if I remember correctly, when the 6 hostages, including an American, Hersh Goldberg Pollan, were murdered in cold blood by their terrorist captors in an underground tunnel.
Yes.
Oh, my wife and I felt such pain. Just like millions of Americans and Jews around the world felt pain on that day. And it seemed like there was no hope. The war in Gaza was at a stalemate. The war in the north was a kind of low-grade, tit-for-tat, without an offensive, almost like the Somme in World War I, where it was all defensive firepower, no offensive maneuvering, drones and anti-tank missiles that Israel's Iron Dome really wasn't equipped to handle, and there was no way out, it looked like. How does Israel retreat from the war in the north and allow its citizenry to go back to live in the north? Remember, almost 70,000 Israelis had been pushed out of their homes in the north and were living in hotel rooms, mostly along in the southeast of the country, in the Negev, by the Dead Sea, and in Jerusalem. How do you get out of this? And Iran is sending ballistic missile barrages with impunity into Israel. The Iraqi Shiite militias and the Syrian militias are constantly firing at Israel, not to mention the Houthis in Yemen. And then finally, no matter what you did to Hezbollah, it would seem they had an infinite source of supply through that Syrian corridor, where no matter how many munitions you destroyed, Iran could continue forever to supply them with ballistic missiles and other weapons. And it seemed like there was no hope for a brighter future. And here we are 3.5 months later, and every analyst, right, center, and left, would tell you that the story is night and day the opposite.
Right.
In Gaza, Israel has killed Yahya Sinwar, Israel has killed Mohammed Deif, and dismantled all 24 of Hamas's battalion commanders. One amazing thing that they showed us when we were in Israel was they showed us the chart of all the leadership of Hamas. Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Deif, Marwan Issa, the number 3, all dead.
Yeah.
Then the 24 battalion commanders, I think they're all dead.
Yeah.
The 96 or so brigade commanders, most of them are dead. Incredible military achievements to the point where Hamas now needs to give up hostages and make humongous concessions just to try to survive for 30 more days, even though it knows the war will continue. In Lebanon, a complete decapitation of Hezbollah's leadership,
Yes.
including killing Hassan Nasrallah in his bunker on September 27th. A beeper and pager and walkie-talkie attack
That was
stunned
phenomenal.
the world,
Yes.
both in its lethality, in its ingenuity and creativeness, but also in how targeted and lawful it was in killing and targeting only terrorists and not even their families or their loved ones, let alone uninvolved civilians. And then, of course, you have the invasion of Lebanon, which killed 3,000 to 4,000, we don't know exactly yet, Hezbollah terrorists, an air assault that took out over 80% of Hezbollah's munitions and weaponry, that sealed off the border with Syria, and that then allowed rebels all across the country in Syria to finally topple the jewel in the Iranian axis of resistance, the Syrian Assad terror regime, which had killed hundreds of thousands of their own people.
Yep.
I don't know if you've seen the images that are emerging from some of those dungeons that Assad kept his political prisoners in. Remember, in the last 10 years, I've been going to Columbia and Yale and other Ivy League schools to speak and to visit my alma maters almost every year. I've never once seen a protest against the Syrian regime that had murdered 600,000 of its own people. I've only seen protests against the Jewish state that was attacked on October 7th and which was lawfully defending itself and which killed 20,000 terrorists in Gaza. Ask yourself why that is. So now, without that Syrian regime, that problem of a corridor of constant resupply from Iran has been, at least for now, temporarily solved, because Hezbollah has admitted yesterday, their leader admitted that they now have lost their route of resupply from Iran. So that's Gaza, that's Hezbollah, that's Syria. What about Iran?
Yes.
Iran's air defenses were destroyed by an Israeli assault in, I think it was October. Israeli fighter jets were flying totally unimpeded and unhindered for about 6 hours over Tehran. The mullahs can lie about it all they want. The Iranian people are not mistaken. They are not confused about that, what that was. Israel was exposing the Iranian terror regime for the paper tiger that it really was, and now their Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters, their nuclear programs are fully exposed. There's been talk in the news about an Israeli, potentially with American support, potentially with American agreement, strikes on their nuclear reactors. There's nothing Iran can do about it if Israel and the United States choose to do that, because all of the air defenses along the route in Syria have now been destroyed over the last week, because most of the relevant Iranian air defenses, Russian-made, were destroyed in that attack in October. So the future for Israel is bright. It's still a Western, vibrant, liberal democracy in the heart of the Middle East. Its army has proven to be, pound for pound, one of the strongest, if not the strongest, in the region, perhaps even in the world. And its economy is going to start to bounce back as reservists come back from Lebanon with the ceasefire, come back from Gaza if there's a truce and temporary ceasefire, to re-inject vibrancy and energy into the local economy.
Baruch Hashem, we need it. Thank you for that hopeful message and making us see that we're having light at the end of the tunnel, and may all our hostages return home as well.
Amen.
Yes. Thank you so much, Judge, for coming on the Black and Jewish
Thank you,
podcast.
Ashira. I'm so honored to be with you.
Well, that is a wrap for this week's show. Please like, comment, and share. I want you to comment down below. Do you now understand the real definition of genocide and occupation? I will see you next week.